This is a remake of a talk I did last night, and we're going to try it again. So this talk is really about metadata, metadata in data sets, and this is data about data. And everybody probably knows, like the traditional way you do this is you have, so everybody knows like the standard ones, last mod date, last modified date, and that's metadata typically about a record. So that's typically data at the record level, and it tells you basically, like when that record has been changed and by whom. The downside of that is it doesn't actually tell you anything about which fields were changed. So typically, you end up having to do something completely different, which is you end up creating a bunch of history records, and then if you need to know who changed which field, you end up having to diff those records and figure out what fields were changed by whom, right? And this only works for dates, right? I mean, it only works if your only interesting metadata is the date. So what if we want to do this for something other than dates, right? So let's play with this. The idea, I have a phone number, and so that is the value, right? And then I need extra metadata about that phone number to make use of it, to know whether to trust it. And so one of those might be validated at. So if this was a mobile number and I needed to send a text to it to verify that that mobile number actually belonged to this person or pretended to, that could be an extra property and I could add it to the phone, but in a lot of ways it is the metadata about this phone number, right? And so validated at is an implicit trust level, and the other phone number might be submitted by. And submitted by, could be the person who submitted it, could be the system that submitted it. You could put, like, if I was doing a phone record, right? Like you can add this, but you might end up with a bunch of metadata about this, all the fields. And I worked on one, and we needed to know like the phone number, whether it was submitted by a human or by our system, and whether or not we had done address, the last date we had done a validation against that against public records. So and you can come up with all kinds of other data, like last modified by, last trust level, all kinds of interesting things there. But the end result is I really need to know where it came from. Let's just pick these, and where it came from and when it came in on that. And so sometimes you may actually see this validated at may drive freshness. And so the more valid, the more fresh a data is, the more likely we are to trust it. Now we could put this phone number is easy because you can put a bunch of these attributes on a phone number table and point to it. But my point is each of the attributes. So if you had a person, you might have a dozen attributes about that person. And the same thing would happen with address. When was the last time this address was validated? Was this, I don't know. There's a bunch of data about it. And so at some level, the attributes you were putting in rows before are actually metadata about that. It's a way to keep track or know the quality of that data. So if we're going to keep this, and let's say we need metadata about something, and again, you can, so what are the main ways that we can do this? So I'm going to claim for the purposes of this discussion that the primary three ways we can do this are snapshots, property metadata with complex properties, and property change events. And again, the amount of metadata on a given field is going to vary by the field, and there are cases where you're going to have all kinds of extra stuff, like you might even have metadata about a name might have nicknames next to it, right? Although that could be modeled differently, but you could consider that metadata. They'd be aliases. So you got to decide what's data and what's metadata, but it sort of runs together. So snapshots, we talked about that, right? Snapshots are, I can do a record-oriented thing, and every time I make a change, I take a snapshot and I add, well, I don't know what we would do there, because if it's at a record level, that one probably isn't going to work. So I'm going to claim no. We're going to claim no, we hate that one, and let's look at the other two. So one is we can do property metadata, complex properties. And so if we looked at the phone number up here, if we had a document store, right, we could just store this thing as a document, have a phone number, and have a bunch of subproperties on it, because we can have an arbitrary dictionary of values or JSON or whatever you want to call it underneath it. And so that we can, each property, whenever we did an update, like as we made changes, actually we might do snapshots here, but what I had been talking about before was row snapshots didn't work before. And in this case, for doing versioning, we could just version this section of the document, and all the metadata with this section of the document would go with it. And so that would be great, right? And that kind of drives into the other one, right? Like, so another way to do this is we could create a change event every time we make a change, and the metadata is on the change event. So the metadata goes on the change event, and every time we update a property, we only update the value, and then the change event is generated. And then when you want to know all the metadata about something, you basically look for the change event that is closest in time to the as of date you're looking at. So I think that's it. The goal here was to just talk about escalate the notion that metadata is a first-class part of your data, and you shouldn't treat it just like some weird bookkeeping field, and that we need to maintain metadata at the property level, and you should come up with a way to do that if you're worried about data lineage, data quality, or whether your data is fit for use. And so that's it. This was a second attempt at using a Rocketbook for this compared to slides, and tell me what you think.